Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our event tonight. Thank you for joining us. It's great to join with you all as well, even if it isn't in person. My name is Gavin Merrifield, and I am one of the committee members for the Manchester Science and Philosophy Group. This is the name for the Manchester local group of a national organisation called Christians in Science. CIS is an organisation that brings together those who are interested in the positive interaction between science and Christian faith. We seek to support those with a professional interest in this area, such as scientists themselves, but also students, theologians, school teachers, historians, and more. We also aim to resource individuals and churches to help them explore this area of their faith and how they can use it within their wider mission and outreach. We host conferences and events throughout the year, such as this one, and run many local groups all around the UK. You can view many of our past events on our website or on our YouTube channel, where you will soon be able to find a recording of tonight's event as well. If you would like to know more about us or to become a member or a friend of CIS, then please check out our website at www.cis.org.uk. So tonight is the first of our new regular series of talks, and will be given by Dr. Bethany Sollereder on the topic of animals and theodicy. Bethany is a theologian from the University of Oxford who has been writing on this area for many years and is the author of the recently published God, Evolution and Animal Suffering, Theodicy Without a Fall. It's maybe a mouthful of a title, but I'm certain the book is very good and well worth picking up a copy of. It's out now in a very affordable paperback. So I think it's fair to say that the topic of theodicy, the whole area of how to bring together a good God alongside the existence of suffering and evil in the world, is perhaps one that in our churches we are a little shy to dive deeply into. Nor is the whole area of animals in Christian theology very often explored, even though we encounter them every day through the natural world, through our pets, and for some of us through our diets. So I think tonight will be potentially doubly challenging, but also perhaps doubly exciting as Bethany speaks to us.
So thank you so much for having me. It's really an odd thing to talk about animal suffering in a time of such intense human suffering. Indeed, times of suffering are probably the worst time to possibly talk about the theology of suffering or why suffering happens. So I hope you won't think of this talk as a set of theological conclusions argued for in a watertight way from an ivory tower, but rather as a sort of theological adventure with two guides, the Christian tradition and modern science. And the Bible stands at the center of the Christian tradition, revealing the person of Christ and the work of God in human history. And we stand in such a great crowd of witnesses who have reflected and lived this living text, trying to interpret what God is saying to us now. We also have the stories that the sciences tell, the far-flung galaxies spinning to the ordered march of natural laws, or the story of how we were riding the continents around on Earth's fiery mantle, every one of us aboard a crustal ship that inch by inch circumnavigates the globe, leaving behind this amazing volcanic wake. But many scientific stories are not so cheerful nor so beautiful. And in fact, many biblical stories are very problematic, but that's a talk for another night. So the destructive tsunami, the starving cheetah, the malignant cancer, or indeed the mutating coronavirus, these are realities that demand our theological attention, especially when they seem to contradict the love of a creating God. Now, when during my master's degree, I first started talking about evolution, I found that in conversations we would talk about fossils and radiometric dating and genetics, but the conversation always ended up in the same place. Doesn't evolutionary creation mean God used death? God used suffering, extinction, violence? Doesn't it make God responsible for such misery in the world, not just human misery, but animal suffering throughout the long ages of the earth? And so I began to think, what can we actually say about that? And how has the Christian theological tradition reflected on that question? So today I'm going to divide my talk into three categories with three sub-approaches in each. And these are not by any means exhaustive, but they'll give you sort of a broad outline of theological possibilities. And they're not mutually exclusive either. Many of these are often used in combination, and I'll be talking a little bit about how those are. So if you don't find yourself in any one of these particularly, that's completely fine. Mix and match as necessary. So the first category is denial. If you deny God's existence or deny evolution or deny animal suffering. So for this talk, I'm not going to spend much time on those first two. If you deny God, then the suffering, misery are unfortunate, but they're not really out of order, since there actually is no order to begin with. There is, as Dawkins says, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. If you deny evolution, as many Christians do, then you still have to account for suffering, but there's not the problem of evolutionary harm. Now, the third option is maybe a bit more appealing. If animals are merely genetic automatons, perhaps they don't really suffer. Maybe their cognitive abilities would allow them to respond to noxious or harmful stimuli, but they don't actually have a center of consciousness that would allow them to suffer. So C.S. Lewis tried this argument in his The Problem of Pain, and Michael Murray has recently reissued it. And at some levels of life, it's probably true to say that there is not much suffering. I don't think bacteria have existential angst or viruses, and for all the squeamish value it held for Darwin, I don't think that caterpillars suffer much when the Ichneumonidae lay their eggs inside them. But this no suffering or neo-Cartesian argument rests on pretty flimsy grounds when it comes to more complex animals. Anatomical and chemical responses to pain are strikingly similar in mammals and other cognitively complex animals. Long-term behaviors in response to pain are also very similar to ours. So they've started, for example, treating orphaned elephants with PTSD therapies. And in a zoo in Calgary, just south of my hometown of Edmonton in Canada, they had really anxious polar bears. And so they started to give them Xanax. And both of these had a huge amount of success, both PTSD therapies for elephants and Xanax for polar bears. So if the brain and chemical composition and behavior are all extremely similar, it's very difficult to say that the suffering is somehow radically different. Besides that, the Bible is concerned with animal welfare. God's compassion for Nineveh in the book of Jonah extends to all the animals. Psalm 104 speaks of God's care for the creatures in their hunger and thirst. And even Sabbath laws could be compromised in order to give relief to hungry, thirsty, or distressed animals. Christians are not permitted to simply ignore apparent suffering. So let's go forward assuming three things for the rest of this talk: that the Christian God exists, that evolution happened, and that animal suffering is real and morally problematic. So what options are left? So I'm going to take you through two sets of strategies. Both of them are valid Christian options. Both of them have significant strengths and noteworthy drawbacks. The first set of strategies roots evolutionary violence in the concept of the fall. Now, the most popular version of the fall defense dates back to the Reformation period, and this involves finding the root of all suffering, death, violence, and predation in the fall of humans. Calvin said it best in his succinct manner: all created things in themselves blameless, both on earth and in the visible heaven, undergo punishment for our sins. It has not happened through their own fault that they are liable to corruption. There is some deformity of the world which proceeds rather from the sin of man than from the hand of God. And again, for it appears that all the evils of the present life, which experience proves to be innumerable, have proceeded from the same fountain. The inclemency of the air, frost, thunders, unseasonable rains, drought, hail, and whatever is disorderly in the world are the fruits of sin, nor is there any other primary cause of diseases. Now, pre-Reformation writers were not nearly as strong on this point. Augustine, for example, held that only human death and disease were a result of the fall, but that animal death and predatory behavior were both part of God's good plan. Either way, when people ask, how could God allow such suffering? This approach would say, well, God actually has nothing to do with the suffering that has happened. This is humans' fault. God never intended the world to look this way. But there is a problem. If we start thinking about evolution, evolution started some 3.5 billion years ago. Modern hominids are about 200,000 years old, and behaviorally modern humans only about 50,000 years old. So we've only appeared at the tip of the evolutionary shrub, and we were not around to mess up the roots. We know that things were messy. Dinosaurs had bone cancer. Predation long predates even dinosaurs. Parasitism is speculated to be the earliest form of evolutionary violence. So unless you argue that God created the world with the effects of the human fall already in place, as William Dembski does, you have to admit that animal suffering is not the result of human fallenness. Now, adjusting for the sort of chronological problem, there are two other ways to still use the fall with modern science. The second fallenness is the satanic fall approach. So it's championed by Gregory Boyd, Paul Griffiths, and Michael Lloyd. And yes, C.S. Lewis also suggested this at one point. The view still sees sin as the answer for why animals suffer, but because humans were not around to cause the fall, they point to fallen angels who were. They could have corrupted the journey of life in its infancy. Throughout the Bible, these authors argue God is pictured at war with, quote, the gods of the nations, unquote, with the watery sea creatures like the Leviathan. And in the New Testament, we hear a great deal about demonic opposition to God's work. If Satan corrupted the world, it could have been fallen from the very beginning of time. Not just life, but the very fabric of creation could have been corrupted by Satan and his angels. God wanted the world to develop by cooperation and mutualism and symbiosis, and new work in biology is showing that those are, in fact, very effective agents of evolutionary change. But those plans were overthrown by an enemy's interference, and like the farmer's field in the parable of the wheat and the tares, the good is now mixed with the bad. The third approach, which Christopher Southgate has called mysterious fallenness, is similar. The only difference is that it refuses to identify the source of the fall with Satan, but it sort of gestures towards an innate drawing away from the divine purpose in creation. So Celia Dean Drummond calls it the shadow of wisdom's creation. Neil Messer uses Karl Barth's concept of nothingness, that evil is that which God did not will. But in whatever way, creation has always fallen away from its purpose. Violence and parasitism are the shadow realities of life's light, and you cannot have light without the possibility of shadow. Now, these last two positions have the advantage of getting God off the hook. God will work to redeem evolutionary violence and suffering, but God never intended them to happen. God's intention was for peace and plenty, but these were not able to come about due to external influence or the corruptible nature of creation itself. Okay, so far so good. We've got denial, we've got fallenness, and we've got these three of human sin, satanic sin, and fallenness without an explanation. Now the problems. It's rather difficult to square these fallenness approaches with the continual biblical refrain of the goodness of the created world and God's full possession of it. The earth is the Lord's and all that is in it is often said. To make things worse, God regularly delights in the strength, skill, and ingenuity of the most threatening parts of creation. Think of the Leviathan in the divine dialogues of Job, or the lions in Psalm 104. In the Hebrew Bible, there's no sense that the untamed creation is contrary to the divine will, or that the chaotic elements mount any effective opposition to God. But there's also a scientific problem to note with these, and it's that the very competition and violence that these writers want to pin down as evidence of fallenness is directly linked to the beauty, skill, and complexity that they value. Darwin's particular insight was that the grandeur of life came from the war of nature. Or as Holmes Rolston has remarked, the cougar's fang has carved the flanks of the fleet-footed deer. Remove the fangs and the fleet-footed deer would never have been so agile. Attribute the fang to some mysterious evil or to Satan, and the beautiful grace of the deer has to be chalked up to that same satanic source. In the end, you risk having little left to call God's actual creation, little evidence of God's creative work at all. So for these scientific and theological reasons, a number of scholars, including myself, have tried to work things out without appealing to the fall. So Gavin kind of showed my book subtitle, Theodicy Without a Fall. And I just want to make it very clear from the beginning, I don't mean that sin is not real. I don't mean that humans are not fallen from grace or that the world is untouched by fallenness today. Quite contrary to that, I accept the universality of human sinfulness and the historical entrance of sin into human history. So I accept the fallenness of the world today, but not the way that most people think of it. And this is, I'm trying to get to what I mean by without a fall. So we normally imagine the fall to be sort of like a universal virus. Sin released a virulent agent that went and corrupted the whole world, whether human or animal, animate or inanimate. The whole cosmos is now affected, is infected and fallen. But the way I think about the fall is more like imagining a symphony orchestra. So all the players of creation are performing with harmony and skill. But when the human violin section finally enters, it does something like this. Yeah, you've got the siren going on outside. What would happen to a performance if the violinists all did that? Even if every other player continued to play perfectly, if they kept in tune and in rhythm, the whole performance would be futile. It would be utterly ruined by this sort of rogue section that's just doing whatever comes to mind and doing it pretty badly as they go. Human fallenness certainly affects the rest of the created world, but not by changing what they are, but by ruining the performance. So what I mean by theodicy without a fall is simply that I don't think fallenness caused evolutionary violence. I don't think God intended some vastly different evolutionary course with child-friendly asps and pet tigers, and that God, for whatever reason, couldn't quite bring it about. So I'm going to say, apart from humans, the world is on track. This is God's good world. And this is a difficult way to proceed because it means that God chose this beautiful but often ambiguous world, and ambiguous in a way we're all experiencing today. God used a process of evolution to create, and God knew that it would result in many suffering creatures and went ahead anyways. So when it comes to the disadvantages of this approach, here it is. God is firmly on the hook for evolutionary suffering. So why would God create this way? The first reason is that there is no other way. Creation is a package deal. If you want a physical creation that isn't overwhelmed by divine intervention, then you have to give the creation its own integrity. And that means that rocks that fall will maintain their hardness even when they're falling on soft-bodied creatures below. Water that is essential to life will maintain its properties even when it begins to flood or create tsunamis. And the same is true of life. The harm done to prey species is the flourishing of predator species. The more intelligent you make creatures, the more they are able to devise ways of meeting their own needs that come at the cost of others. Even at a very simple and personal level, we can see the package deal at work. The pain systems that we have, for example, are, well, they're painful, but they're very good. They protect us in a threatening environment. And they tell us to take our hands off of hot stoves and to not jump from too high a height. And people born without the ability to feel pain are not supermen and superwomen. Actually, they generally die very young because they don't know how to protect the limitation of their bodies. And so, and this leads to some really interesting theological reflection. So Jesus healed people with leprosy, and if what they had was in fact Hansen's disease, what we call leprosy today, then it means that Jesus' healing was actually giving them back the ability to feel pain, because all that leprosy or Hansen's disease does is kill the pain nerves, and all the subsequent damage comes from people not feeling pain. So the idea of healing being giving pain back is a really, I think, interesting one. And you can't get around it. Painfulness at some level is necessary for a flourishing life. The evolutionary process, for all its cost, is the only way that God could create without constant intervention. Philosophically, package deal arguments are completely unprovable one way or the other. You could always come up with some hypothetical situation for a better world, but no one knows if they would actually work. But scientifically speaking, package deal arguments make sense. Death is an intrinsic part of life. Pain is necessary to flourishing, and evolution's glories are directly linked to its bloodshed. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Bible is not at all squeamish about the suffering in the world or the predatorial nature of creation. Yes, there are passages throughout Isaiah that describe the future kingdom as lacking these elements, but over and over again, the biblical writers celebrate God's creation of the really difficult bits of the world. Psalm 104 celebrates the divine care of young lions and the great Leviathan. The divine dialogues in Job are little more than an extended celebration of God's direct responsibility for all of creation's most problematic elements. So whether it's storm clouds and hail and monsters or snowstorms, God takes credit for it all. So from chapter 39, does the eagle soar at your command or build its nest on high? It dwells on a cliff and stays there at night. A rocky crag is its stronghold. Its young ones feast on blood, and where the slain are, there it is. There's no indication that the eagle's bloodthirsty nature is contrary to God's will. There's no sense that its way of living is somehow the tragic consequences of a fall. Instead, the continual chorus of creation is, it is good, it is good, it is very good. So this world with tsunamis and tigers burning bright is God's very good creation. So first, the creation is a package deal, and this approach is often and easily combined with the second, a sort of free process approach, a name given to it by John Polkinghorne. So instead of saying God is bound by the laws of logic, it says that God is bound by the logic of love. Even if God could have made a world where everything would get along perfectly, that would come at the cost of freedom. And love is inherently freedom granting. So love celebrates the other as the other. And God didn't just create a world where creatures get made. God created a world where creatures get to make themselves, to be something other than God. And so free process extends something like the free will defense into the rest of the natural world. The only difference is that instead of moral free will, it concentrates on what we might call agency, or even better, behavioral plasticity. So far as we can tell, many animals make choices about food sources, lifestyles, or even group culture. They innovate, and given limited food sources, will try out new culinary possibilities. Once creatures decide to eat one another, violence and predation enters the system. One example of this kind of behavioral plasticity is the South Georgia pintail, a nice little duck in Antarctica that has been observed scavenging seal carcasses like a vulture. It just sticks its head into the body and goes for it. And it's the only meat-eating duck so far as we're aware. So God's gift of love to the pintail is to allow it the freedom to innovate. Instead of preventing or controlling its behavior, it is free to explore creation and possibilities of survival. And the same is true of all parasites and predators. And it's also true of bunny rabbits and sheep too, by the way. Their antics may seem innocent enough to us, but from the perspective of grass, this is a destroyer of worlds. So what's all this freedom for, you might ask? Let me suggest two things. The freedom is for the sake of the animals themselves, so that they can be themselves most fully. They can develop and play and fight and eat and be eaten. It's good for creatures to be free. They forge new ways of being in the world. They hone skills and create desires. And God's love for each animal sets it in this sort of open playing field and invites it to have an adventure of life. But there might be other reasons as well. Let's suppose, and I will suppose, that one of God's purposes in creation is to develop creatures who can love. But what is love? Is it natural? Or does God simply, maybe God just downloads it into the human consciousness? Well, Andrew Elphinstone suggests that love is not a naturally occurring thing in nature, nor can it be implanted as sort of a full-blown quality in people. For Elphinstone, love is made up of the rougher ingredients of evolutionary desires, and as such, it's a rather late newcomer to the evolutionary party. So love is the desire for the good of the beloved and the desire for union with the beloved. But where do those desires come from? So I'm not sure about you, but when I look at the natural world, I see a world full of desires. Evolution produces varied desires for security, for food, for reproduction, for care. And in Elphinstone's thought, God gathers up these evolutionary desires and sort of brews them, ferments them together in the human soul to make love. The love is like bread. It is a result of natural ingredients you can't do without grain. But it also needs a further process of human culture. In the same way, love is evolutionary desires transfigured by the work of God in the human soul. So while the freedom to develop and follow desires is good for creatures themselves, the very development of desire also has a part to play in the larger story of God creating a creature made in God's own image, able to participate in that same love that energizes the cosmos. And that brings us to our very last perspective, that the whole of creation is summed up in the cross of Christ. What do I mean by that? Now, Holmes Rolston has suggested that creation is cruciform. The whole of nature tells a story like Christ's passion. Innocent suffering and death are followed by new life. For Rolston, this is seen in the ability of the world to respond to competition, violence, death, and destruction with inexhaustible new life. And nothing is wasted in nature. We often talk about evolutionary processes wasteful, but it's not wasted. Everything is recycled up into more complex, more diverse, and ever more glorious forms. Nature is redeemed from within, according to Rolston. Lauren Wilkinson writes even more provocatively, there is unanswerable death and pain at every link in the great chain of life. The Christians must learn to see that the suffering is to be exchanged and borne, and that the central figure in that exchange is Christ, the Lamb that was slain from the creation of the world. In every death, every evolutionary pain, Christ is present. And I said earlier that these sort of without a fall approaches leave God firmly on the hook, but more accurately, they leave God firmly on the cross. The whole of creation is marked by Christ's passion, and Christ bears not only the sin of the world, but participates in and takes up the suffering of all creatures on the cross. But insofar as the world participates in the cross, it also participates in Christ's resurrection. So Robert Farrar Capon puts it this way, and this is a bit of a long quote, but it's worth it, so stick with me with it. Christ wins in every triumph and loses in every loss. Christ dies when a chicken dies and rises when an egg hatches. He lies slain in the wreckage of all Aprils. He weeps in the ruins of all springs. And this strange, savage, gorgeous world is the way it is because incomprehensibly, that is his style. The gospel of the incarnation is preached, not so that we can tell people the world now means something it didn't mean before, but so that they may finally learn what it has been about all along. The whole of nature is cruciform. So evolutionary suffering in this view has always pointed toward the cross. Its violence silently preaches the injustice of Christ's death. Its ecological renewal speaks of life beyond death. And speaking of life beyond death, I don't think I've mentioned redemption yet. And this is crucial to any attempt to talk about suffering in the world. No theodicy worth its salt would dare to skip it. And I think it stretches across 8 of our 9 categories. So let's end on this note that sort of unifies the different Christian perspectives, something that we can all agree on. Now, traditionally, Christians have not talked too much about animal redemption. Yes, those passages in Isaiah about the lion laying down with the lamb might indicate that there's some presence of animals in the new creation. Likewise, St. Paul insists in Colossians 1:20 that everything was reconciled to God through Christ, whether things on earth or things in heaven, and presumably that includes animals. John Wesley, the revivalist preacher, took it a step further and speculated vividly, and perhaps wildly, you may say, about animal resurrection. His worry was not about animal souls, because everyone always maintained that they have souls of some kind, but he worried whether they could adequately enjoy the resurrected life. So his solution, that in the resurrection, God would give animals human levels of intellect so that they could reflect on and praise the glories of God's love with full understanding. Listen to what he says. The whole brute creation will then undoubtedly, I like using undoubtedly. I think we don't use it very often in theological discourse, and it's probably a good thing, but okay, I'm getting off track. Undoubtedly be restored, not only to the vigor, strength, and swiftness which they had at their creation, but to a far higher degree of each than they ever enjoyed. They will be restored not only to that measure of understanding which they had in paradise, but to a degree of it as much higher than that as the understanding of an elephant is beyond that of a worm. As a recompense for what they once suffered while under the bondage of corruption, they shall enjoy happiness suited to their state, without alloy, without interruption, and without end. I just think it's a beautiful view of the new creation. Wesley employs a vivid theological imagination that we often shy away from. And John Wesley understood, as we often forget, that the redemption of the cosmos is based on the logic of God's love, and that redemption is as wide and expansive as the love of God. And John's brother Charles wrote the great hymn, Love Divine, All Loves Excelling, which ends with the lines, changed from glory into glory, till with thee we take our place, till we cast our crowns before thee, lost in wonder, love, and praise. Now, our theological imagination only gives us a poor, reflected glimpse of God's glory. But every time I now sing this hymn, I envision the participants of the new creation, not just people and angels, but also lions and lambs and beetles and bacteria, the swans and the seals, all creatures, great and small, lovely and ugly, predator, parasite, and prey, the winged birds and the creatures of the deep, all joining the heavenly worship, lost in wonder, love, and praise. And that perhaps is the place to end, just this sort of briefest vision of God's glory and goodness. And it's not an answer to why we or animals suffer, but it contextualizes all the rest in a wider story of God's love and grace that began with our creation in love, continues with the suffering of the cross, and ends in the resolution of all things redeemed in Christ. And it is in the story of Christ crucified and resurrected that all theology finds its anchor. But more than theology, all Christian practice finds its anchor in the cross of Christ. So when human suffering is added to that of the evolutionary process, when we face raw pain, these categories won't make much of a difference at all. But what does tend to make a difference is the presence of Christ and the ability to participate in his passion, to rest in his love, and to trust in Christ's ability to recreate sorrows into joy. When, as Lady Norwich says, Lady Julian says, all shall be well, and all manners of things shall be well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bethany, for your talk. That was a huge amount to take in there. Like, just amazing the range of views that you can dig out of this topic. We've got a few questions starting to come in. So as they're coming in, can you just maybe tell us a little bit about what brought you to studying theodicy?
Yeah, very happy to do that. I made the rather unwise decision to try and work out personal angst about the world through academic work. So I was at a church where one of the pastors was extremely relationally abusive, not sexually abusive, but manipulative, difficult. And I remember just trying to figure out how in the world could God allow this to happen as the church was ripping apart, as people were being hurt. And I wanted to know what kind of offerings the Christian tradition had. And so I began to study, and then I realized there is a lot written on that question, far more than I could read in a lifetime. So I thought I would go for a slightly smaller and easier question, which is the question of non-human animals in evolutionary field. And yeah, so I started in science and religion really at the beginning of my master's degree and haven't looked back.
Very good. So we have some questions, like I say, coming in, so I shall get to those. First question, what sort of physical evidence might help us differentiate between the different views on animal suffering you've presented?
Okay, that's an interesting question. So what kind of physical evidence? Well, the one that really sets sort of the human agency apart from the satanic agency and the mysterious fall approaches are, and indeed the without a fall ones, are that there's this long history of suffering and predation in the geological record. So, I mentioned very quickly, we know dinosaurs had cancer. We know that predation is about 350 million years old. As soon as complex life forms were emerging in the Cambrian, things started finding ways to eat each other. And so I think that, at least from a chronological point of view, it makes the idea that this is due to human agency very, very difficult unless you take the sort of view that William Dembski does, that somehow God instituted the fallenness that would happen before fallenness happened. And Stephen Webb does something similar in his book. So I think what the physical evidence says in terms of the history of suffering points towards the last five that I've put in. Physical evidence in terms of no animal suffering is, again, it's pretty difficult to hold that animals don't suffer in important ways when you're talking about mammals or birds or cephalopods or creatures with fairly advanced systems. But I mean, it's hard to even say when that starts. The way that trees interact, in fact, in a forest, and their communication lines are actually very similar to the connections that our neurons have in a brain. So can a forest suffer? Possibly. Certainly trees react to pain or noxious stimuli that are given to them. And we can't really tell any further than that. But then again, I can't tell whether any of you suffer. All I have is the analogy that when I hurt, I go, ah! And then, if I do the same thing to you, you react similarly. So we can't access any other creature's pain. So we have to go by looking at whether there are stress hormones or stress reactions or long-term behaviors. That's why I talked about the PTSD as well. So I'm not sure if that's precisely what was being asked, but feel free to clarify in the chat.
Related to about animals having the capacity to suffer, there's a question about animals being able to love. So can dogs love their human masters? Can sheep love their lambs?
That's really great. So I sort of talked about this whole idea that love is sort of a latecomer and it's built out of the desires of the evolutionary desires that are sort of brewed into this love thing. Now, in that, I did say that love is this combination of the evolutionary desires with the work of people and the work of God. So because I hold that particular view of love, I'm actually going to say that there isn't love in the animal world. And many people will disagree with me. They will say, I love my dog and my dog loves me back. And believe me, I've got, the picture of my dog is, there we go. There's Annie, the Dalmatian, swimming in a pond of yuck. And I love her deeply. And she shows deep and abiding affection for me. But I don't think it's love, because I think that love requires more than instinctual affection. I think that love does more than just altruism or self-sacrifice. And I think there's a sort of self-reflexive complexity when you start to look at what love means, that I think puts it out of the reach of animals. And it's the kind of love where, if you are a parent, and I'm not a parent, so take this with a grain of salt, but if you're a parent and you have a child who is determined to follow actions that are harmful to themselves, you may intervene, you may try and protect, but there may also come a point where you say, actually, I have to step back. Even though my instincts are screaming for me to take control, to overwhelm your freedom, there also comes a point where we step back and we say, you need to walk your path. And I can't, all my love means that there's an external limit on my action that is placed. And I think that that's actually a reflection of God's love in so many ways. That the greater the love is internally, often there's a greater limit on how much we intervene, how much we react. And so I think that that's where we start to see the sort of kenotic element of the cross coming in. That the great love of Christ meant that Christ didn't fight back, didn't intervene, wasn't saved. And that's the kind of love that I don't think is present in the animal kingdom. So I would say that they have all the ingredients, but they don't put those ingredients together into the new emergence of love.
Okay, so a related question in many respects. If evolutionary theory says that humans are not, at least in genetic origin, distinct from other creatures, at what point did humans, presumably modern manifestation of us, like you're saying, 50,000 years, at what point did they start to exist? And could this be a point of reconciliation with more conservative understandings in the Bible? But then maybe related to that, at what point did suffering and love begin to exist? I would ask as well.
Well, I think suffering exists throughout the animal kingdom. So I don't think suffering is a new thing, but just love. But at what point did proto-humans become humans is actually an answer that nobody can give. We don't have enough evidence scientifically to give sort of, it was the Neolithic period, or it was 50,000 years, or that. And actually, theologically, that doesn't matter as much as you might think it does, because what we have is we have a world where you clearly have creatures that are not human, that don't love, that aren't made in the image of God. And now we see humans who are made in the image of God, who have a problem of sin, who need to be redeemed by Christ. What happened in the middle bits? as long as we know that the transition took place, we're okay. So I don't have a good answer for this is where it happened, but I could give at least two possibilities. One, that God called humans and began to work in them in such a way that those ingredients became love for the first time, and that in that process they turned away from love, and thus sin entered the world, because the process of developing love takes human cooperation. So I could say, it was whenever God called them, and that happened in a moment to a population or a couple, but there would be no genetic change to that. There would be no physical change to that. And actually, Joshua Moritz uses the idea of election to talk about being made in the image of God, where he's saying, Israel at one point was called out of all the nations, not because they were different, not because they were better, but precisely because they weren't better, precisely because they had no particular attributes that set them apart. So what I wouldn't do is try and say, oh, when humans use tools, that's what it is. When they develop music or when they developed religious ritual, that's the point. I'm not going to do that, because I think that the change is not something that happened in us so much as it happened between our relationship with God, and God called and began that process. And that could also, second idea, happen over a long period, through generations, over time, a gradual progression. So just as you could also see being made in the image of God, as Christ is the perfect image of God. We are all in the process of becoming made in the image of God. In a sense, we're all still striving to become fully human in the way that Christ was fully human. So what point did we become human? Maybe we haven't gotten there yet.
Interesting. Related to that, another question. One of the problems with the concept of the fall is that it's thought of as a point in linear time. So there is a before and an after. Is the biblical concept not more one of banishment, so that the universe as we experience is in a sense fallen throughout its history? And is there scope for human agency in the fall, then, in that this is the kind of universe we have effectively chosen?
Wow. I think I need to look at the chat for that one. I'm not sure how to bring up.
It's in the bottom question in the Q&A tab at the bottom.
Okay, the bottom one. Okay, out of the problems with the concept of the fall is that it's thought of as a point in linear time. So there's a before and after. Yes. Well, it depends. So the mysterious fall and the satanic agency actually don't have a before and a fall after. So the origins of creation are simultaneous with the origins of fall. So if you look at Dean Drummond or Paul Fiddes or Boyd or any of those, say, the fallenness is always inherent. So there isn't actually a before and after. Let me continue. Is the biblical concept not more one of banishment, so that the universe we experience is in a sense fallen throughout its history? Is there scope for human agency in the fall, in that the kind of universe we have is in effect chosen? Yeah, so if I understand this right, and I may not, Peter, the biblical concept is one of banishment, and it is one that the universe we experience is in a sense fallen throughout its history. So in a sense, if I go back to my violin metaphor, if my violin is out of tune, I can never get good music from it, no matter, a really skillful player could probably do it, but I certainly couldn't. Or if it was broken. And so in a sense, the human experience is one of brokenness all the way through. It's a fallenness all the way through. And I mean, if we go back to the much maligned Calvinism, and I do give Reformed theology a hard time, but when it talks about total depravity, that's what it means, is that every aspect of our experience is fallen, not that things are as bad as they could possibly be, which is often how it's misinterpreted. So I would say, like, the universe is not fallen, but we experience it to be fallen because we ourselves are fallen. Is there scope for human agency in the fall? Yeah, yeah, because there's also scope for human agency and redemption. So I think we still, even in a fallen condition, we have choice to work towards redemption, to work towards peace, to work towards goodness, to work towards the relief of suffering, all those things. Yeah, so absolutely, there is scope for human agency.
Okay, we're going to zoom from one end of time right to the other end of time now. So going from the beginning to the end, we have a question. Says, you are right on target when limiting the fall and its resulting death to humanity. If animal death and suffering is part of the good creation, why then do so many assert that they cannot be part of the new creation? Revelation 21:4, no death or mourning or crying or pain, surely refers to humanity in overturning humanity's sin and its result, yet it is almost invariably expanded to encompass all of creation. So doesn't the package deal argument still hold in the new creation?
Yes. So this is a great question. So, you know, how can you have mosquito heaven and human heaven? Won't we still have the same payoffs? There's a great Calvin and Hobbes. I don't know if you know the comic Calvin and Hobbes. It's really popular in North America, where, you know, this little boy is talking to his tiger and he's kind of saying, you know, will there be tigers in heaven? And they go through this whole thing, and it kind of comes out to, you know, the tiger doesn't think that heaven could be heaven if he can't eat, but then people won't find it happy because the tigers are still going to be trying to eat them. And that's not the kind of, in a sense, that's based on the world that we know. So when I say that things are a package deal, they're a package deal here because we have certain values like reproduction and being caught in this expanding time, that are values here and now, but may not hold true. So one of the things about the new creation that's not often talked about is reproduction. So Jesus says, you know, there won't be marriage in heaven, and presumably that goes with there not being reproduction. So it may be that there are goods and values here that are not in the new creation. And that's part of what makes going through this worthwhile, because the other question is simply, why wouldn't God create heaven first? If you have that possibility, why not jump there? But maybe it's because creatures could only be made in this kind of a process. So I don't think that once creatures are made, that the package deal necessarily has to retain the same values and the same harms that it does here as it will there. But in the end, what we have to say is, I don't know. I have no idea how it will work, but I trust God's goodness.
Excellent. A question about how there's a range of views, whereas in churches we have very much more certain views presented to us for our theology of the fall and suffering. How will we communicate this range of views to our churches, and how can it impact the individual Christian in their growth and discipleship?
Yeah. Well, if you want to communicate this to your congregations, please, please, please steal this material. Please steal this table, steal these categories, and use it. And I would be delighted if you do that. If I can be of any help in giving you information, or giving you, I mean, I had books up earlier. Yeah, and I think one of the things that's helpful is that none of these things, your belief in any of these positions is, I think, not finally important for being a Christian. These are not first order questions like, is Jesus Lord? You know, I think there's like the Jesus is Lord, and then after that there's everything else, and this isn't that everything else. So we can have discussion, we can have dialogue, and we can allow people to come to where they're theologically comfortable, and maybe push that and pull that, but not say, you know what, you have to believe this because this is obviously true. So I mean, in the way that I did this, I did give away where I sit in the thing, largely because my book is out and it's really hard not to now. But my preference would actually have been to not even mention where I sit on this at all, but to simply give the strengths and weaknesses of both positions, and then let people figure out what they think.
So, talking of your position, what comes next for you, researching and writing in this field?
Well, the next thing that I'm just finishing up now, and it won't be out till next August, unfortunately, because the timing is really long, is actually another answer to precisely this last question. So I'm writing a theological choose your own adventure. I don't know if any of you read those novels when you're a kid. So it's sort of, you're reading through a story, you're a princess walking through the forest, and then you get to a fork in the road, and you can either go up to the castle or down to the lake. And if you want to go up to the castle, you turn to page 8. If you want to go down to the lake, you turn to page 14. And then you make decisions along the way, and sometimes you die and go back to the beginning, and sometimes you find different ways, and the story changes as you choose what to do. So I've actually written a theological book called Why Is There Suffering, with that kind of a journey through the pages, where you make a decision about, God exists and is loving, God exists but doesn't care, God doesn't exist, and you follow through the options. So that's what I'm working on now, and it's precisely to give people back this sort of choosing capacity that the way we have been teaching doesn't give to people often. So I'm trying to do that in book form.
Excellent. Would it be in choose your own adventure form, though?
Well, essentially. So we're still debating over the subtitle. So why is there suffering, and then something along the lines of you navigate theology's hardest question, but we're not certain about the subtitle.
I'll look forward to that.
If you can spell my last name, which is a feat, you will be able to find it. So.
Sure. Thank you. We are starting to run out of time now. There are some questions we've not come to, so I'll just have a quick scoop through to see if there's a few quick ones. Quick question on kind of reading the Bible. How do you square your understanding of animal suffering with the implications of Genesis 1 to 2, that the animals were vegetarian? And possibly linked to that one, language of the lion lying down with the lamb?
Yeah, really helpful. A few things. Let me deal with Isaiah first. So in Isaiah, we have this, the lion will lay down with the lamb, da, da, da. There are other places in Isaiah, and I think it's Isaiah 35, where it kind of says, there will be no tigers or lions on my holy mountain. There will be no ravenous beasts. And so I mean, I don't think those depictions of the new creation are sort of photographs that we can take and say, this is how it will be, because there's actually contradictions between them. Will there be lions that lay down with lambs, or will there be no lions or any type of ravenous beasts? Again, we go back to, we don't know. And the Bible is actually not clear on what it will be like. So at that point, we have to then use our theological imagination. In terms of Genesis 1 and 2, that's actually a very long discussion, and probably the best I could do would be to point you to certain sources like Ian Proven's work, or chapter 3, I think it is, or chapter 2, chapter 3. I switched them at one point in my book that talks about the Bible and the fall. But in short, there is a distinction in the Hebrew between the animals that are given the food to eat and all the animals. And so I think what God is giving every green food to is not all animals, but actually domesticated animals. Humans and domesticated animals are vegetarian, but the wild creatures always were. And what God actually gives permission to after the Noahic covenant is hunting wild animals. So there's a division between people's animals and God's animals, and God's saying, I'll give you all the harvest the fruit, harvest the vegetables that you find out there, but don't touch my animals. And later he's saying, you can touch, you can have my animals as well. But the fact that Abel is a shepherd would point towards that meat eating was actually a normal thing. There is the depiction of beasts of the field, which are usually carnivorous animals in Hebrew terms in Genesis 1. And of course, the Leviathan of the sea. I mean, big fish eat smaller fish, always have, and have no option of being vegetarian. So I think we could argue that this is simply an ancient Hebrew understanding of the world and we shouldn't be taking it literally, or we can say, actually, even the text itself is not entirely without ambiguity.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll just start to wrap up now. Just to say, we'll try and make that table of further resources you had on your last slide available on the CIS website, probably, because that's a really useful overview for taking things further, I think. So I would like to thank our speaker for coming tonight and presenting to us. Bethany, it's undoubtedly a large subject, and I think you've done a fantastic job of presenting not just your own view, but giving us a real flavour for the many other views that are out there on theodicy. If we were meeting in person, I would ask you to thank Bethany in the customary way, but since we're not, we'll all just suffer the manifest silence of Zoom at our various ends. If you want to keep in touch with us and see what other events and things we're up to, keep following our Eventbrite page, but also consider signing up to our local group mailing list. The email address for that is sec.cismanchester@yahoo.co.uk, or it can be found on the Manchester page of the CIS website at cis.org.uk. So that concludes today's session. We thank Bethany again for a fascinating talk, and thank you all for coming, and take care, and we will look forward to seeing you again in about a month's time. Thank you, and good night.